Hey dear audience, hope you would be fine. Today we would discuss The Language of Paradox by Cleanth Brooks. This is an essay of criticism. We have been discussing new criticism and formalism as well. So today this important essay we would be discussing it into two parts. In the first part we would be discussing what is the major proponents which Cleanth Brooks has discussed, and later on what is the criticism on it, and after that we would be reaching towards a conclusion. So in this essay, The Language of Paradox, Cleanth Brooks emphasized that the language of poetry is different from that of the sciences. This is an admitted fact, as we have to see that the language of science is different and the language of poetry different. But Cleanth over here emphasized that what is the difference between the scientific language and the language of poetry? That is the use of different connotations and different literary devices. Means in the poetry we use the literary devices, and in scientific language we do not use the literary devices. So the use of literary devices in the language of poetry makes it poetic, while the lack of literary devices in the language of science make it as scientific language. So he says that this literary devices, it means poetry is more based on the language of paradoxes, claiming that he is interested in our seeing that the paradoxes spring from the very nature of the poet's language. Means the poet only use one language, and that is the language of paradoxes. Means paradox means when definitely it means irony as well. What he says and what he means, the difference between that, and what he says he does not mean that, what he says he means different things. For example, there are two types of meaning. One is the connotative meaning and the other is the denotative meaning. So poet might be using a word, but he might be employing its connotative meaning rather than the denotative meaning. So all this is we are going to about it. So he says that it is the language in which the connotations play as great part as the denotations, means in the poetry of language of the poetry. And as I do not mean that the connotations are important as supplying some sort of frill or the trimming, something external to the real matter in the hand, I mean that the poet does not use a notion at all, as a scientist may properly be said to do so. The poet within the limits has to make up his language as he goes. Means what we use say, in a simple term we may say that poet and the poetry has its own language, and the poetry language of the poetry moves according to the will and the use of language by the poet. So poet for his poetry has own language, has its own usage as well. In this passage, Brooks stresses that the poetic language is inherently different from the scientific language, because the poet constructs his language as he goes and defines his own rules. The poet then has control over the language and must take an active role in the shaping of what literature means. The poet then is not limited to the denotations of the word, but instead reveal in the possible connotations of the word. Connotative means which are the societal meaning, which are not the dictionary meaning. The individual poet is given a great deal of power then in the process of knowledge making, and the reader is isolated from the production of the meanings. Means it is up to the will of the reader, of the poet, that how he used for example, if I perceive the meaning of woman as a female of the man, so the poet might be taking the woman as a symbol of beauty. So it's up to the will and the intention of the poet that in which context he is going to take that word. Paradoxes are literary devices, as we have been discussing that in that ambiguity, and the 7 types of ambiguity we have discussed, and in the Russian formalism's theory of Russian formalism we have discussed that through the literary devices a poet or an artist make the by the use of literary devices makes the defamiliarize things. He defamiliarizes the things. He makes the familiar things as defamiliar. So for that defamiliarization, he used different literary devices. So paradox is one of those literary devices. In the literature, the paradox is a literary device consisting of anomalous juxtaposition of incongruous ideas for the sake of striking expositions or unexpected insights. This functions as a method of literary composition and analysis which involves examining apparently contradiction statements and drawing conclusion either to reconcile them or to explain their presence. So when we are going to analyze any poem or any piece of literature, then we only focus on these literary devices, that what sort of image, what sort of situation the poet has created through those literary devices. For example, the poem by Kublai Khan is by S.T. Coleridge. So on the mode of analysis, we see that what sort of words, juxtapositions, what sort of connotations he has used with those use of the words. For example, he used the word cave of snow. So what do you mean by the cave of snow? The cave of snow is not possible. So here he might be using the cave of snow for the cold weather, lavishes weather, like that means about the joy situation, lovely coolness of the temple. So like this we extract, we analyze that what are the connotative meaning of these words. So by examining that, we come to the conclusion Cleanth Brooks is an active member of the neo-critical movement, outlines the use of the reading poems throughout the paradox as a method of critical interpretations. So he says that poetry is only based on the paradoxes, means poetry without paradox, use of paradox is not possible. Paradox in poetry means that the tension that the surface of a very words can lead to apparent contradictions and hypocrisies. His seminal works, The Language of Paradox, lays on the Brooks' argument for the centrality of the paradox by demonstrating that paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to the poetry. Means poetry is not possible without the use of paradox. And the argument is based on the connection that the referential language is too vague for the specific message of a poet expresses. He must make up his language as it goes. For example, saying the things in simple words definitely does not create a poetic effect. So Cleanth Brooks is of the view that for creating an effect, for creating a meaning in a more attentive sense, makes the poet to make his message in a very different, in a very attractive way. So for the attention, for grabbing the attention of the readers, and for creating a sensational, creating an impact. Every language has its an impact. Even the scientific language has the function of information, transferring information. But what to aggravate the meaning of poetry more than the scientific language, Cleanth Brooks is of the view that the poet used the paradoxes so that the readers attracted to that language and attracted to his message and attracted to the message which is embedded in that verse or the poem or poetry. This Brooks argues because words are mutable and meaning shift when words are placed in relation to one another. So this has been the major context, the argument which Cleanth Brooks has developed But here is under criticism on that as well. R.S. Crane, in his essay The Critical Monism of Cleanth Brooks, criticizes Cleanth Brooks that he has taken, for example, he has developed an argument that the language of poetry is not possible without paradox. So he says that Brooks' centrality of the paradox is totally nonsense, one-sidedness. For one, Brooks believes that the very structure of poetry is paradox and ignores the other subtleties of imaginations. Means, for example, he says that if someone is an expert of using the language in paradox, would we be able to call him as a poet? For the qualification of a poet, there are other things as well. For example, imagination, your observation, your mastery over the language, your literariness, sensitivity towards the things. All these are the parameters for a poet, but only the use of language in paradoxes is not the prime parameter of a poet. To some extent, that Crane is also justified in this criticism against Cleanth Brooks, and that power that the poets bring to their poems, Brooks simply believes that imagination reveals itself in balance, and reconciliation of opposite are the disconcord qualities. Brooks, in leaning on the crutch of that paradox, only discuss the truth when poetry can reveal, and speaks nothing about the pleasure it gives. Means he says that truth comes through paradoxes. Also, by defining poetry as uniquely has a structure of paradox, Brooks ignores the power of paradox in everyday conversation and discourse, including scientific discourse. Means there are paradoxes in the scientific discourse as well, while according to Crane, Brooks just draw a line of demarcation between the poetic discourse and the scientific discourse, that the poetic discourse is based on the paradoxes, and scientific discourse does not have paradoxes, while Crane is of the view that the both languages, means scientific language even in the poetic language, both share the paradoxes. In everyday which Brooks claimed was opposed to the poetry. Crane interestingly makes a claim, and some sort of a saying against Cleanth Brooks, and he says that his poem is like a modern history as is equal to Einstein's formula that E is equal to mc squared. Means the poetry is only possible if it is a paradox. Means paradox and the poetry are the same thing. So which is a profound paradox in that matter and energy are the same things. Means he makes severe criticism on the Cleanth Brooks. So now we move to our conclusions, that what actually it is. Our conclusion is this, that devices are necessary. Poetry comes through the meanings come through different literary devices, and even the devices are used in the scientific discourse as well. But in the poetic, in the language of poetry, devices are used more with more frequency rather than the use of scientific discourse. But meanings are not particular to any device. We have to keep in mind that, for example, if there is a poem, in that poem paradox might be used, defamiliarization might be used, irony might be used, but all these devices never means that the meanings are particular to any singular device. So poetry and art includes more devices than the paradox, but paradox is among such. Means only paradox is not used in the poetry. There are other literary devices as well, but paradox as a literary devices is among such devices which are helpful in creating the meaning. So we move to this conclusion that the use of literary devices in the language of poetry is as compared to more frequent as compared to the scientific language. And any poet is supposed to have many characteristics to be for the qualification of a poet to be a poet. And for the creation of a poet, he used many literary devices, and paradox is one of those literary devices. With this conclusion, we move to our end. Thank you very much.